So we might get started. We've got a few people, which is great. So I'm going to do a brief introduction and hand over to our special guest today, who is Dr. Alex Norman. But I'll introduce him a little bit more in a moment. I want to start this TASA Thursday postgrad session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet. So I'm sitting on the land of the Kaurna people. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So as I said, our special guest is Dr. Alex Norman. He is a senior lecturer in the Graduate Research School at Western Sydney University, where his primary role is directing the Masters of Research program and co-delivering its core units on research writing, the sociology of research, and on public audience writing, which is a great collection of expertise to particularly talk about this all very important first engagement people get to have with research around the abstract. And I think it's something that is just key to selling the importance of our writing. And so getting it right is really important. Alex's central research interests, though, focus on the confluence of travel practices and religious practices. His book, Spiritual Tourism, examines the intersection of travel and secular spiritual practice by contemporary Westerners. So his own research area, I also think, is really fascinating. I've heard Alex talk about it as just a great way to get to travel around and see really interesting buildings a lot of the time himself. So, you know, why not align your research interests with the opportunity to go and look at interesting stuff? Anyway, that's my introduction for Alex. Thank you all for joining. I'm just going to hand over to him now.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks everyone for coming and for giving me your time today. And Ben, thanks for having me to this session. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from this very empty looking cabin, which I just finished kind of refitting. I had my first experience of doing plasterboard and painting and stuff like that. But this cabin sits on Gadigal Wongal land. I'm in Sydney at the moment, and so I want to acknowledge elders past and present, and that my broadcast, my simulcast today is coming from to you from those lands. As Ben said, my name's Alex, and I'm at Western Sydney Uni, and this is a talk about abstracts and abstract writing that I and my colleague, Dr. Jack Sonus, who also runs the Master of Research program at Western with me, that he and I have developed over the last 5 years. Essentially, we've given this talk more or less to every cohort of Master of Research students at Western who's come through the program since 2016. So it comes from quite a bit of experience helping graduate students think about how to express your writing, your research in a very condensed form. And one of the things that we realized very early on was that none of us had ever been taught how to write an abstract. It's something that features in almost every form of professional writing that we do as researchers. If we're applying for grants, there's a précis or an abstract at the front of the grant. If we're submitting journal articles, if we're doing book proposals, thesis proposals, any kind of condensed form of writing like an abstract or a project description or a précis or a summary like that fits into what we're doing, and it's something very common in our work, but we're never taught like how to do it, what it's for. We're really not even taught what an abstract is. And so Jack and I developed this kind of session, I suppose, to begin thinking about that and to begin helping people like you to think about that. Because ultimately, and I'll develop this a little bit more, ultimately our belief, and so this is like a co-presentation from me and Jack in a sense. I'm here speaking and Jack is at home working on other stuff. But our belief is that all of the work we do as researchers is in the service of text. That is, that everything that we do moves towards producing the written word in some form so that others can learn from the work that we've done. And the abstract is where you begin to kind of do that work, telling people about what you've done. So for me to get to the bit about where I can tell you what I think an abstract is and what I think abstracts are for and how to write them, I need to give you a bit of information about the ground on which that program sits for us, like where we're coming from in our messages. Because a few of the things that I have to say today might be a little bit, there might be some kind of hairs ripped out as we tear band-aids off, you know. Some of it might be a little bit painful, some of the things that I say, but it comes from, you know, from a place of love and care, and it comes from, you know, the heart and mind of a colleague who wants to help other colleagues do well. So I'll switch over now to start telling you about where I come from in terms of doing this work. Okay. Abstract writing. This is me and Jack. So part of this story of abstract writing is a little bit of a story of me. Ben said that my role is the director of the Master of Research program at Western. That's a program that deals with students from all over the university. So I don't just have social scientists in my classroom, I have biochemists and inorganic chemists and astrophysicists and historians and writers, like fiction writers, like the whole landscape of the university is in my classroom. And to deal with that classroom, that kind of breadth of disciplinary expectations, Jack and I had to develop teaching methods and content that worked for people across disciplinary differences, and that cut really down to the core of what we were trying to do. And that's been very, very valuable for us, because what we've been able to kind of cultivate is this understanding and knowledge of writing in particular, and the craft of writing. So I have Ben mentioned I did a doctorate on what I call spiritual tourism. I came from a religious studies background. Religious studies is a kind of an odd grouping of disciplines. It's not a discipline. It involves history, sociology, anthropology, psychology, art studies and criticism, like a whole bunch of things kind of lumped in together. And when I finished my doctorate, like so many other people, I started looking for work, and some of the work that I ended up with was as an editor. And one of the roles in particular that I had was working with Professor Althea Possum-Ionesidi when she was editor-in-chief of the Journal of Sociology, and I was the managing editor at the time of the Journal of Sociology. And that taught me a lot about the value of abstracts, because I could see as the managing editor, one of my roles was to parse the submissions to the journal that came in and hand them on to Althea if I thought they were worth us pursuing any further. And it was via the abstract that I was able to do a lot of that work. That is, if the abstract functioned well and told me what the article was about and communicated sufficiently that it was valuable for the journal, that is being in scope for the journal, then I was able to kind of hand it over to Althea, and she'd be able to then send it out to reviewers and work with the other editors and so on. And I did a bunch of other editing work as well. And a few years ago, I landed a postdoc in the United States working in a neuroscience lab. So I've had a pretty kind of varied career. And that was a whole other thing, like in terms of writing. One of the things that it really taught me is that every kind of little field or corner of a field and discipline has their way of expressing things in the world and what they see. And sometimes what happens is that you get caught in a kind of in a way of discourse that is kind of opaque to other people. And so I found that when I would write things for the lab in the US, they would kind of come back to me and say, we don't understand what you're talking about, even though you're talking about the work that we've been doing. And so I had to kind of learn how to retranslate my understanding of the world, usually into much simpler language, but also, of course, learn the language of neuroscience and how to speak within that community. And that's one of the themes that I want to develop a little bit today, is that a big part of learning to write, like full stop, but particularly learning to write something like an abstract, which is a very condensed piece of writing, is that you need to understand yourself as writing for a particular community of discourse, a particular community of readers who have a set of expectations about how they think text will look, and a set of expectations about the kinds of ideas and the kinds of things that they will find valuable for them. So I'll get to that in a little bit more. And as Ben mentioned too, my work with Jack Sonis has been on what we are tentatively calling research studies, or research maybe. We're interested in research as a thing humans do. There's lots of kind of philosophy of science, there's history of science, you know, philosophy of sociology, history of sociology, but the topic of research as a thing, as like a discrete thing, we feel like hasn't really been discussed fully, hasn't been treated to sufficient attention, at least for our purposes. And so we've been developing that a little bit. We haven't published anything, of course. We've been kind of too busy teaching, but we've got some stuff in the pipeline. And the other thread that he and I have developed together is thinking about writing for readers. And on that note, what I want to do is acknowledge that everything that I'm talking to, there's nothing that I'm talking about today that's kind of novel and unique and is the product of Jack and Alex alone. It's stuff that we've borrowed very liberally from people like Inga Mewburn, Larry McInerney at the University of Chicago, Judy Swan at the University of at Princeton, George Gopin, Barbara Kamler and Pat Thompson, like a whole bunch of people have done heaps of writing about writing and helped us to think about how you go about writing an abstract. So with all of those kind of library cards laid out, a couple of big ideas first. And the first one is that what we do, and what you guys are doing in particular at this level, you are at expert level. That is that you might not feel like you're an expert writer, and you might not even feel like you're an expert on your subject matter, but you are. And that is that you have more knowledge about your particular topic, your field of interest, than most other people in the world. There are really only a handful of people who have the kind of knowledge and expertise and understanding that you have. And to do that work, to do expert level thinking, which is what you need to do to be able to produce the kinds of texts and discourse that you do in your job as a postgraduate student or as a researcher. To do that job is very, very hard. We're dealing with, the world is much more complex than it first appears. That's like a fundamental premise of like every science and every social science, is that whatever we think, it's much more complicated than that. And it's so complicated, in fact, that in order to do the mental work, to do the thinking for research, you have to write. You have to kind of unpack things from your head and put them on the page. And that helps you then kind of park ideas and compare things. We see the same kind of thing in mathematics, where the ability to put things on the blackboard or the whiteboard or the screen, for example, is crucial to being able to do really complex mathematics. And the social sciences, like sociology, are no different. We need to do writing to do our work. So to think at expert level, you need to do heaps and heaps of kind of what Jack and I call think writing. You need to kind of just kind of think onto the page, and the page or the screen in a sense becomes an extension of your mind. So that's one premise. The second premise is that when we make text as researchers, what we're doing, or what we're trying to do at least, that is outward facing text, things like journal articles, books, conference presentations, so forth. What we're doing is trying to help our colleagues do their own thinking work about the world. So we're not only writing to express ourselves, we're writing to help other people find ways to think about the world a little bit better, do their own work a little bit more easily. The third premise is that readers read text in order to think about the world. That kind of follows on from the previous one, that when we write, what we're trying to do is help other people. And that is where we begin to hit up against a problem, because one of the issues we have as researchers is that for most of us, all of our learning career up until this point, we have been taught to write for a reader who cares about what we think about the world and how we think about the world. And this is the first Band-Aid that I'm going to rip off. There's nice. This is the Band-Aid. Nobody cares what you think. So, oof, sorry, it's a little bit painful. The hairs have come out. Nobody cares what you think. Let me explain what I mean by that. It's not that your thinking isn't valuable. It is, of course it is. Your thinking about the world is hugely valuable because what you're doing is expert level thinking and understanding. You're trying to understand the world like nobody else has understood the world before. The problem is nobody cares about what you think because when they read your text, what they're doing is they're trying to improve their thinking. So you could say nobody cares about what you think, they care about what they think, but even that's a little bit too simplistic. What matters is that your text, which is the product of your thinking, helps a person do their own thinking. And that's what I mean by nobody cares what you think. And when I say that you've been taught for your whole career to write in the way that expresses what you think, what I mean is that through primary school, high school, and undergraduate programs, what we do is we set learning tasks in which you display your thinking and the assessor reads the work and says, yes, your thinking is shows that you're learning the things that I have taught you, right? And that doesn't apply anymore when you're doing research, because what you're doing in research is you're not trying to show somebody that you did the correct thinking. You're trying to show somebody that they're doing the wrong thinking and that the thinking that you've done is a better way of thinking about the world. So that's pretty complex as an idea, but when I started thinking that way about my writing, that it wasn't about what I thought, it was about trying to help other people think better about the world, all of a sudden it felt like shackles had been thrown off me, and that I understood now what my job was as a writer, that I wasn't trying to express all of the complexities of thinking that were going on in me. I was just trying to do enough to help somebody think a little bit better about a problem they were working on. The other Band-Aid is along these lines. Usually when we're taught writing, we're taught that there are rules about writing, and that we need to pay attention to those rules. And if we pay attention to those rules, everything will be sufficient, and our writing will work. And that goes along the lines of clarity, that you have to write clearly, that your sentences and paragraphs and sections and chapters and so forth have to be well organized, and that you have to be persuasive. Persuasive writing is something that we teach our kids in primary school. It's really important. The problem is none of those matter. Clear, organized, and persuasive. It doesn't matter if the text that you write isn't valuable to the reader. If it's not valuable to them, it's useless. And then if it's clear, organized, persuasive, and useless, it's useless. And so, sorry, that's the Band-Aid. I can see Ben laughing. That's the Band-Aid, and it's a interesting one to think about, because you can see that what I'm trying to get to you is that a lot of the ways that we in the academy have taught you to write if you've come through an undergraduate program aren't actually that helpful now that you're in the world of research. You have to relearn how to write. And this isn't a remedial course, right? This isn't something that I would expect any of you to know or have thought about before. This is expert level. Like, we're done with club netball and we're now at the AIS. This is serious, Mum. And we're going to do serious work now. And serious work is valuable work. And so when you think about it in terms of your own reading, when you're reading through, say you're skipping through the Journal of Sociology contents and you're looking at the titles, and when a title of an article kind of piques your interest, you look at the abstract. Probably what you do, that's what the research on how readers read suggests, is that most of us read abstracts first. And we'll go and read the abstract, and if the abstract doesn't signal to us anything about the topic, either the topic that we're working on or the kinds of problems that we're working on, we'll just kind of move on. And that's fine. The article doesn't have value for us, and so we're going to move on and try and find another article. The problem is, in a lot of our writing, We haven't been taught to tell our readers that there is value there. So a lot of readers who could find value in the work that you've done, the really important expert level thinking that you've done, some readers, quite a few, I would say, can't find your work because you haven't done a good enough job of expressing to them the value of your work for them. That's where abstracts can come in and help. Of course, it applies to the rest of your writing too, but you start that work with your readers in your abstracts. And finally, the last premise is that what you're dealing with when you're writing an abstract is a community of readers, right? There's a group of people. I've said that phrase a couple of times now, but it's really important to emphasize that what we're dealing with here are social groups. If we're sociologists, we ought to know how groups of people get along together. And one of the things you've got to do as a writer, in that if you want to be a part of that community and if you want to signal value to people, you have to know what's valuable to that community of readers. And you can only know that by doing your own reading and reading of what's already published in the field and thinking about how you might change that discourse or might add to it in some way. So, sure, clear, organized, and persuasive are important, but value is really where it's at here. And we signal value by signaling problems, research problems, essentially. So, an abstract. What is an abstract? I mean, it's really simple. If you took away nothing else from this presentation, but that an abstract is a summary, then like we're winning. Because I can tell you, colleagues, that I have read a great many abstracts that do not in any way summarize the text that follows. They're just kind of, bubbles of thought that came out because part of what happened was somebody wrote the article and then went to submit it to the journal, and there was that little text box that said max 250 words abstract, and they went, oh, I've got to write some more. Well, and then they just smash out something that vaguely has to do with what they've written, and then it's submitted and it just gets carried forth and published, and there it is. The article might be terrific, but often abstracts are an afterthought. Part of that is because when one of those rules that exists for writing is that you should write the abstract last, right? We've probably all heard that rule. I want to say that that's a crap rule. I think you should write the abstract first and last. That is, you should write it first to try and organize your thinking in terms of how you want to do the work you want to do. But then once you've got your final product, you should also write an abstract that really does summarize the thing that you've put together for your colleagues. So an abstract really is just a summary. Like if you just come away kind of knowing that in an abstract, what I have to do is summarize the article or summarize the conference presentation that I want to do or summarize the book, like just that alone will win you so much in terms of creating value for your readers. But getting started, let's just take, now that we've been going for like 20 minutes, let's just take 1 or 2 minutes here. Write down, if you want, what you're trying to do with your research. I'm not going to ask you to share this. This is just kind of for your own kind of edification. We're in the zone of thinking about writing and thinking about abstracts and thinking about summarizing our work. Take a couple of minutes to just capitalize upon that buzz and energy and just vomit some stuff on the page. So I'll, well, my second hand is at the 12 o'clock right now. So I'm going to pause speaking for 60 seconds and then we'll come back. Have a cup of tea. All right. So hopefully, with all of my signaling about value there, and my mentions of research problems, hopefully one of the things that you wrote down, if you wrote anything down, is that you concentrated in some way upon a problem that you want to address in your work in terms of what you're trying to do and what your research is about. We hear a lot of talk about research problems and research questions and stuff like that. A question is just a synonym for our purposes here. A question is a synonym for a problem, something that we're trying to do better or think better about or think differently about in some way. When it comes to the world of publishing and the world of assessing grants, book proposals, thesis proposals, stuff like that, abstracts are really, really, really valuable. We know from the metrics of various websites, we know from research that's been published in a few different contexts, that is disciplinary contexts, not just limited to fields like sociology, but biology and astronomy and a few others, that abstracts function as the place where a reader makes a decision about whether to read an article or not. So abstracts matter for us in the first instance because they matter for the text itself. They matter in the sense of summarizing the content and the structure of what the reader will find. And that's important in terms, kind of like the contents of a book. You know, it gives you an indication of what's inside. It functions as the label on the tin. You know, here is what's inside. If you're a person who's interested in the kinds of things that are in the abstract, then you should probably read on and you'll get something of value out of this. So in terms of why abstracts matter, they're really important for helping readers find our work. So it's important then that you talk about not just the topic, but how you do things, your methods in an abstract, and also why you're doing things and what your reader might get out of reading your article. That is, like what the take-homes are, what the implications of the work are. So in that sense, an abstract is essentially a tiny, tiny, tiny version of your piece of writing. In many respects, it will look like a tiny version. It'll have the kind of intro, body, conclusion kind of structure to it, which is what I'm going to go through in a bit. But also in terms of the reader, and like I really want to emphasize that whatever you're writing, one of the things that you should be doing is thinking about your reader, or really I should have put there thinking about readers, your community of readers in the plural. And that is that the abstract functions for them to inform them about what the article is, but also to persuade them to read. When I said before that nobody cares about what you think, part of that is trying to jolt you out of the way of writing where you are demonstrating to your teacher that you have understood the problem well enough. And when you're doing that writing, you're kind of piecing together complex understandings of the world. You know, you'll take this bit here, then that bit, and then you'll think, oh, that goes there, then I'll put this here and that there, and actually, no, that goes there. But when a reader reads, they're going this way. And if they encounter that kind of logical structure, that will kind of mess them up. And they'll slow down, they'll get confused. And often when we think about the world and just write, without thinking about readers and thinking about communicating with our community of discourse, what we'll end up producing is a confusing piece of text that works for our head, but doesn't work for somebody coming at it. The idea is fresh. So in terms of persuasion, what we're trying to do is kind of lay out in a way a reader will read what our text is going to cover, but also why it's important. That is what problems grappled with. And I mentioned before that part of what you're trying to do as a research writer is tell other researchers that they have problems that you have a solution for. And often they're problems that they don't even know they have. Like that's one of the best things about being a graduate student that I miss, is that you're right at the very tip of the discourse. Like one of the classic things that we get you to do across all fields really is, you know, a review of the literature that exists in your field. Very few professors have done a review of literature recently. And when you've done all of that reading, you have this terrific synoptic view of what's going on in your field, and you're able to find and express problems that people didn't know they had in their thinking. So we're trying to tell our reader, well, for one, we're trying to summarize what our text contains, and for two, we're trying to convince our readers, people who might find value in our work, that there is indeed value there for them and that they should read on. Because one of the one of the great things is that in addition to teaching you to write the wrong way, we've taught you to write for people who are paid to read your writing. And from now on, nobody's going to be paid to read your writing. You know, the only reason we read essays from students is because we're paid, really, if we're, you know, going to be brutally honest about it. And that doesn't apply with articles or books. And that's an interesting problem for us. So all of the professional writing that we do needs to kind of bend towards our readers. We're trying to think about our readers. What have they been talking about? What have they expressed kind of concern or a desire for kind of gaps to be filled? What have they said is less important to cover that we might think actually is important? You're trying to look at a conversation, essentially. You're trying to look at your readers as a group of people having a conversation, and you're trying to inject yourself into that conversation. And your abstract is that first step in helping put your work into that conversation, but also helping those people do their work a little bit better. And your job as a writer, of course, is to help that conversation along. Like, and this is something that I'm really, well, both Jack and I are really kind of passionate about, is that is this ethos of service, I suppose, that what we're trying to do is make the world a better place. And we do that through knowledge work by creating better understanding of how the world works. It's kind of, you know, comes from that premise that everything that we write is wrong. Everything that we write is wrong, and that needs to be corrected in the future by the colleagues who come after us. And one of the ways that one of our duties is to kind of find what's kind of wrong or incorrect in the writing that's come before and just make little corrections that help others do it better. All right, so with apologies for the formatting of this, this is an abstract for this session. I'm just going to read it out. And this abstract is written with the rules that I want to teach you. Many high degree research students have to write abstracts for thesis proposals, journal articles, and conference presentations as part of their candidature. While there is a wealth of advice about writing, both in the humanities and the sciences, the steps required to produce a well-written abstract can be difficult to find. This workshop presents information about abstract writing and puts it into a function-based framework that students can use to develop their writing skills. This framework helps students see abstract writing as a stepwise procedure and helps them to write abstracts that are useful for readers. So I wrote that in 2016, about 15 minutes before the first time we gave this session, because I realized I needed an example to work with, and I wrote it according to these rules. I want you to think about, if this is the second thing to take away from this session, I want you to think about an abstract as having that function of first function, that primary function of summarizing the text. And that function is made up of 4 sub-functions. And these are those 4 sub-functions. The first function is to bring the reader's focus into wherever we are. That is, we could be anywhere. We could be talking about any topic in the whole universe. Where are we generally? So you bring their attention to your subject matter. The second function is to locate the specific kind of area of your work, the specific topic, the specific research problem or context, and the specific kinds of justifications that you may or may not need, depending on the work that you're doing, for doing the work. The third function of an abstract, or third sub-function of an abstract, is to explain what you did, or explain what you're going to do if you're writing a proposal, for example, or explain what's in the article. Like, what are we going to find? What did you do? How did you do it? What did you read? What did you find? How did you do your analysis? Those kinds of things. And then the fourth, the very important function, is the implications. What happens because a reader will read this? What will they take away from this session? What will they be able to do better? How will they be able to think better about the world because of reading your article? So 4 functions. And I haven't done it here, but usually I would kind of bold or something the first letter to make it a bit of an acrostic, which spells out fly if you pronounce it in a German kind of way, F-L-E-I. Usually we have a little hang glider kind of icon that kind of sits at the side of the page. But if you can, in your abstracts, if you can have each one of these sub-functions working, you will have a really well-functioning abstract. It might not be the best thing in the world. It might not be kind of poetry in motion, but it will be a good functioning abstract that helps your reader to see, this is what's in the text, this is what I can expect to find, right? And one of the really important things I think for all of us is that, and why I think for me, and this is something that I borrowed, sorry, from Barbara Kamler and Pat Thompson, is that this 4-function method just makes abstract writing super easy. Like, you can do 1 sentence on each of these and you'll have about 100 words and you'll have a perfectly functional abstract. And when I said I wrote the abstract, this abstract, in like 15 minutes before the first time I gave this session in 2016, like, for serious, like, that's what I did. I took those 4 functions and I made each sentence do 1 function. Colleagues, this changed my life. Like, seriously, I had gone from thinking, what the hell do? I have to submit an abstract for the TASA conference. It's coming up. I hardly know what I'm going to talk about. I know generally, but like, how do I actually put an abstract together? Who's reading it up? Why do they care about what? Just do this, guys. Like, this will save you so much time, but also so much angst as well. Just executing these 4 functions. Now, Jack and I, in our research about this, have looked at hundreds of abstracts, probably thousands by now, to code them for these 4 functions, to see, like, how many abstracts are there that kind of do this well. We find that most abstracts that our students report as being good abstracts, that is helpful for them, have all 4 functions in the abstract. They do all 4 things, but they don't always do it in the order that I presented it here. That is, often what you will see in the first sentence of an abstract is an explain sentence. This article examines the things, you know, and then it goes on to kind of locate the problem, explain a little bit more about the work, and then talk about the implications. But I would say to you that this structure, first of all, the general problem, second, the specific problem, third, what you did about it, what's going to occur in the article, and finally the implications, that's the kind of safest structure to go with, because it follows the kind of natural, I guess what we would call a natural storytelling structure. It's basically kind of Goldilocks was hanging around, then there were some problems, she went and did some stuff, they lived happily ever after, right? And like, we all laugh at this, but all research is like this, right? Intro, yeah? Then we get into our methods, which is their explain, and our conclusions, which are our implications. Like, and so this is the natural way that humans have evolved through billions of years, well, hundreds of millions, since, you know, Australopithecus and stuff like that, to tell stories to one another. Like, this is the structure of language, at least in English, that we have, is to go like this, to introduce a problem, to show how it matters, to show what was done about the problem, and then to show what happened because the problem was solved. But this is one half, right? I mentioned before, like, if you go away from this session with the first lesson about abstracts being summaries, and the second that you execute these 4 functions in any abstract for a good, well-functioning abstract, then you'll be winning. Your life will be a lot easier, I hope. Like, that's the main take home from this talk, is this 4-function method of writing an abstract. That if you can focus your reader, locate the problem, explain what you did, and tell your reader about what the implications of your work are in an abstract in 250 words, you'll be winning. But the other really important one, and I want to show you an example now, is that you need to signal value for your reader. That is, that you can have a really well-functioning abstract, but that isn't all that valuable for your readers. It doesn't really signal value. So let's go here. This is something that I borrowed from Larry McInerney at the University of Chicago, the director of the writing program, the writing program at University of Chicago. Some terrific videos on YouTube that you'll see I've borrowed from very liberally in this presentation that I encourage you to watch. I'm going to read this out, and then we're going to read the same abstract, but with more value words inserted. So, as a consequence of the cost of sex, the theoretical, this is a biology abstract, I should say. As a consequence of the cost of sex, the theoretical probability of clonal and sexual coexistence is low. Observation of coexistence in vertebrate taxa has been reported. Within the frozen niche variation model, the relevant parameter is difference in overall niche breadth. A wider niche breadth for the sexuals than for the clones is predicted in performance in monocultures. Performances in mixtures do not indicate such a relationship. Switching of behaviours or resource use patterns between mixed and pure cultures may be the cause. The proposed study will examine this prediction of the FNV, or frozen niche variation model. All right, so that's a pretty good abstract in terms of function. In like the last sentence is the explained sentence. There's not much in terms of implication there, but there's lots of explanation. Like we know what it's about. We know roughly what the problem is. The issue is that for most people, this is a really hard abstract to parse. Even though the functions are there, the way the author has used language makes it hard for us to see where the problems are, right? So let's reread the article written to emphasize problems and to try and tell the reader this is where you will find value. As a consequence of the cost of sex, the theoretical probability of clonal and sexual coexistence is low. That's the same sentence. Nonetheless, observation of coexistence in vertebrate taxa has been widely reported. Within the accepted model of frozen niche variation, coexistence is explained by difference in overall niche breadth. However, although the FNV model correctly predicts wider niche breadth for the sexuals than for the clones, its predictions are inconsistent with reported performances in mixtures. The proposed study will examine whether the anomaly may be explained by the switching of behaviours or resource use patterns between mixed and pure cultures. So there's some really important things that have changed there. One of them is the use of these kinds of words. Is that highlighting coming up there? Nonetheless. The word nonetheless. And then also within the accepted model. That's saying, hey guys, in my discourse community, you guys accepted the model. Like it's you I'm speaking to. And then a nice however, like however is always a problem. Like there's a problem when you're using a however. All right. So little tricks about using language like that is how we begin to signal value for readers. You're speaking to a community of discourse. They all have their own ways of talking about the problems within your field, but problems are our bread and butter. Problems are what we deal with. All of us are dealing with problems, theoretical problems, methodological problems. We're dealing with problems of lack of data, improper use of data. All of us in the world of research are trying to grapple with problems that we're trying to think about and do better. And we signal problems with transitional phrases like although, despite, however, while, and we signal to our research community that this is something for them that they will find valuable by simply referring to them, like really just referring either to methods or theories, referring to particular people if you're being that specific in your work, but also referring to the research that's gone on before. Because what you're trying to do is tell your reader, I'm talking about things that you find that you have talked about, and I think you will be interested in the work that I've been doing. And you do all of that, again, within that 250 or so words of your abstract. And if you're doing these kinds of transitional phrases and these kinds of signaling to your readers within the 4 functions, then you really will have a nicely humming abstract. Works well, tells your readers what's going on, helps them see what you're trying to do in your work and what they'll find inside. That's really important. Probably all of us have read an abstract and thought, awesome, this is exactly what I'm looking for. This is wonderful. And then 2 hours later, you're thinking, where's the, well, you said you were going to talk about X and I haven't found X yet. All of us have been there. I may even have done it myself in my own abstract writing past before I came across this, this method. There were a couple of other examples that I have, but I won't go into them now just because we can open up for questions or whatever. thanks again for your time. Time is the most valuable gift. Thank you for giving it to me. I hope I've been able to give you something that you can use in your own work, and that you will add some value to your research work, your writing work, and will help you have a little bit more ease in your own writing. At the very least, not cause that sensation of fear and anxiety when you see that empty text box for an abstract and think, what the hell do I do here? Hopefully now you will know. Just got to do the 4 functions and we're away. Cool. Well, I guess I should stop sharing the screen.
Thanks, Alex. That is excellent, mate. We will definitely open up to some questions, conversations. Yeah, I haven't encountered that 4-function method before. I've heard of your workshop and I've heard great things, and now I know it is great. Honestly, like if someone had given me this simple process 5 years ago, my life would have been a lot easier. I have a question, but I want to see if anybody else does first. So I think I see Anthony nodding. Go for it, mate.
Hey, Alex, thanks so much for that. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about titles as well.
Yeah.
About how you structure a title.
In terms of how you structure a title, I'm not sure that I've done a huge amount of thinking on that, or at least not enough to be able to tell you what I think works and what I think doesn't. However, there is some research and it probably varies a little bit by field and context, but there is some research that suggests that at least in some fields, titles with puns in them are downloaded, that's the measure, are downloaded less than titles without puns, or articles with titles that have no pun. I'm not sure what the causative elements are there. I think probably what's going on are norms within a discourse community. Like, for example, in sociology, it's really common to have like pithy title, explanatory subtitle. There are things are awesome. Bourdieu and the explanation of whatever. That we often do that in sociology. And I think what that is a part of trying to invoke like the spirit of the article, like the kind of, here's the general gist. Often we'll use a quote in the title and then a bit of an explainer, or maybe sometimes vice versa in titles. But my message for you and for everyone in terms of writing titles is that it's part of the label on the tin. And you should try to explain what you're doing in the piece, in the title. And that can be very difficult because, for a very complex thing, which is everything, it can be hard to summarize that. And that's why, I think a simple explanation of what you did is often pretty helpful for a title. Examining what would be an example from my own work. Examining meditation discourse in popular media. That if I haven't lied in the title, that the article is going to be an examination of the popular discourse about meditation, right? Yeah. I would want to avoid disappointing the reader. That's the main thing. Be accurate. Don't fib. And sometimes that happens. Like you'll sometimes think, what does this title have to do with the article? I read an article the other day about that. Yeah, this one, in fact. You can see all the scribbles I've made all over it. From retreat center to clinic to boardroom, ? Perils and promises of the modern mindfulness movement. It didn't mention boardrooms at all. I was like, well, you didn't mention boardrooms. You didn't even mention corporate culture. Like, you didn't even mention retreat centers. And it was like it was the first 2 words. I should say, as a kind of trick in priming, a good trick for your abstract and for your title as well is if you can use the topic that you're talking about as the first words in the title or the abstract, that's a neat kind of priming trick. So with that focus function, you know, you might, let's say if I was rewriting this, you know, this thing, the first word would be mindfulness, because the article's about mindfulness. In fact, the article's about the mindfulness movement. So, you know, the title maybe would be mindfulness movement and its adoption in clinical settings. You know, that's so, it's what a friend of mine used to call Soviet. Like, it's so functional. There's no poetry in that title at all, but at least it's functional. You know, at least I'm not lying to my readers about what they can expect to find. Yeah, it's a good question, actually. It's something that I'd like to do more research about, is like titles. So I had an argument when I published my dissertation, as my book, Spiritual Tourism, which you can buy from Bloomsbury, or actually, no, don't buy it. It's at the library, just borrow it. We had an argument about the title, and they were taking a very functional position, because I'd invented some hugely unhelpful title, which I thought was terrific. It was something like Spiritual Tourism, the Secular Examination of the Self in the Mirror of Religious Practice, or something like that, which was accurate enough, but it was like, they were just like, too much metaphor, man. Like, give it a rest. Anyway, good question. Thanks, Anthony.
Definitely the equal, if not more, stress-inducing part of a submission for me is getting the title right. So that's great.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? While people are thinking, I've got a question, which I think would be, I don't know, maybe easy to answer. To what extent, Alex, do you think some of these principles, and you know, some of them maybe not, but in general, these could be taught at an undergraduate level rather than at the graduate level? I mean, maybe, you know, they're not quite on the same, you know, forefront of the research, but you describe it as a problem that we've learned to write one way, and now we have to learn to write a different way. So could we teach them earlier?
Yeah, that is a really good question, because part of the problem is, because we have learning outcomes, we have to assess somehow the learning outcomes. And if one of the learning outcomes has demonstrated the ability to think about stuff in the way that I think ought to be thought about, the student has no choice but to, like, the violence of that situation is the student has no choice but to write in the way that the lecturer or the unit coordinator thinks that they want to see. That's you're performing the learning, essentially. But with that said, I think I would love to see undergraduate writing courses that are just about writing, the art, craft, and science of writing, of making, of turning the snapping of synapses into squiggly lines on a page or a screen. That's really hard, to go from like here to squiggles. And particularly and I think you can do it in parallel. Like, I think you could in parallel teach, here's the content, you have to show me that you've thought about the content in the right way, but also here's how to write to create value for readers and persuade them to think in a different way. I think that's well within the capability, certainly of undergraduates. I'd say like high school as well, like even primary school. I speak to my son about this, and my daughter now, she started primary school as well, like that when they deal with persuasive writing, that one of the things that they're doing is they're showing their teachers that they can do things, but that they also need to understand what a text is and what a text is trying to do. Like, essentially this is a subset of critical discourse analysis and critical thinking. You know, that any text, a movie, a TV show, a book, it needs to be unpacked for what it is, but also for the intentions of the authors and, you know, all of that stuff. It's, you know, it's part of a bigger matrix. I'd love to see that kind of teaching at undergraduate level. But I think, and here I'll kind of get a little bit sociological for a change. Here I think the big problem is that we culturally, and socially we devalue writing because it's so normal. That is, we churn out emails and texts, and like we write so frequently that we think we can already do it. You know, we're already kind of capable. But then also, I think we're dealing with a socio-cultural paradigm in Western contexts, or no, in Anglo. I'm going to rephrase that as Anglophone contexts. Where we think that all of the magic happens here, and that it doesn't happen, the magic doesn't happen anywhere but here. It certainly doesn't happen on the page. And it really, like, absolutely doesn't happen in the interaction with other human beings. And that's one of the reasons why Jack and I really emphasize a community of discourse, because I think that's I think that way of thinking, that everything that you do happens up here as a researcher or as a thinker, I think that way of thinking about things and thinking about the world is really problematic and incorrect, because the nature of human knowledge, the nature of discourse, the very fact that we use language calls to us the kind of interpersonal and the interconnected nature of that. And like the only reason we would write anything at all is so that other people could read it. So it's silly to think that it all happens up here. Plus, there's all of the terrific research from psychology and neuroscience, which understands like the role of the medium in your work. And that's why I mentioned like that writing, to do your thinking, you have to write. That's why like a pen or a keyboard, like they are the tools of our trade. And how many of us have ever thought hard about our tools? I would contend that in the academy, rarely do any of us think about like these kinds of things, right? These are our tools. They're our tools, and we never think about them. That's crazy, because we are laboring under the myth that it all occurs up here, and we'll just like, and it'll come out, it'll flow from our fingers. There's no one else involved. I don't need to speak to anyone, just the lone genius. Up on the
That's
stage,
excellent.
like I am right now. Yeah.
Thanks, man. I'm sorry to interrupt a little bit at the end there, but we are running out of time. This has been an excellent
I got pretty soapboxy there. That was that's a hobby horse soapbox that I love to stand on.
But it's an important one, and I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways, and I think it's what you're saying there as well, is that your writing is a service to your readers because it helps them think. So that is a paradigm shifting way of thinking for me. I do just quickly, before we want to end, throw to Anne, because Anne tweeted us during the week to do a quick introduction. So Anne, do you want to introduce who you have with you today?
Hi everyone. Can you hear me okay, Ben?
Yep.
Ben, I just wanted to introduce Janice, and Janice is staying with me at the moment. And Janice is a postgraduate student at Bachelor Institute in Northern Territory, and she lives and works in Warburton, which is one of Australia's most remote Indigenous communities. It's here in West Australia.
Hi everyone, I really enjoyed the seminar this morning. Thank you so very, very much.
Incredible to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think Alex is kind of a really good representation of some of the great work that has been done on this weekly / for us monthly postgraduate TASA Thursday session. So it's a good one to be part of. Thank you all. I'm going to wrap us there because I'm conscious that people have other things to go and do. But again, thank you, Alex.
I'll chuck these slides on my website and I'll tweet back to you an email so that people can access them.
That would be fantastic. Thank you so much. And the session is being recorded, so we'll make sure we tweet that out as well. Great. Thanks again, Alex. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for your time.